Hey everybody. What I thought I would do today is introduce you to a small part of a wargaming campaign world that I'm just kind of throwing together. It has an aesthetic that I really like, and I've brought up one of the factions a couple of times during my skirmish gaming videos. And what I'm referring to is Lourn. Now, when I talk about Lourn, I'm referring to a nation that's it's a small part of the world, and this is kind of my main player nation. There are player nations and there are NPC nations. And right now, Lourn is the only one with 100% set name, with the exception of these guys, but we will talk about them later. But in short, there's Lourn used to be a larger nation. It's split into two. These guys are another faction we'll get into another time. There are a couple other factions that don't have set territory because they are from either outer space or underground, like the Mole Men. The primary system that I'm going to be using for this setting is Gaslight. I really like how that works out, and I like sort of the tech level that it's sort of default set at. And I thought what I'd do today is to break down this faction now that I'm mostly done with it. I want to say I'm like 98% done with this army. The army is 100% kit bash. There are a few things that have stayed relatively vanilla, mainly some guns and things that are just left as is because they didn't really need any modification. They're just painted kind of funny. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over some of the lore of this faction and just introduce you to the world through its eyes. So Lourn, as you can see here, it's not really all that big. Lourn went through a schism, I want to say about 65 to 70 years before the time that the gameplay starts. I'll call it our campaign. Um, and during the schism, the country separated into two parts. This part down here, which ended up following a rogue sea deity and are mostly ruled by a degenerate cult, and the north, which became Lourn, is a heavily monarchical country, which has been isolationist basically since the schism, and is only now coming out of that. It has the faction's aesthetic is heavily influenced by both medieval and kind of machine age France, although there is a little bit of Britain in there. And we're going to get into that once we get into the models. So what I'm first going to do is I'm going to show you the infantry, and we're just going to work our way through the ranks, and I'll show you some of the cool stuff that I've painted up. The backbone of the Lornish army is the Peasant Levy, and these guys take the form of masses of armed infantry. These guys are usually equipped with metal armor, a lot of times chainmail and helmets. These things are still in wide use throughout Lourn. Their typical weapons loadout is a dagger, a rifle with a bayonet attachment, and in some cases a grenade, though not everybody has them. Lornish soldiers, they always have a pack of supplies on their back, and on their belt they have a small toolkit, which usually involves utility knives, other tools, and most notably a shovel for digging trenches. The peasant levies are known to be fiercely loyal to their Shire Reeve commanders, as most citizens of Lourn are deeply religious and believe that those above them rule them by divine right. Sometimes you'll see variations in armor and gear, and that is because that most of their equipment is made locally and in factories and even by local builders who will manufacture these weapons based on regional blueprints rather than a national standard. So, but invariably, they're all equipped with firearms, melee weapons, and sometimes explosives. The packs usually contain things like food rations, water, cooking kits, and other things that local Shire Reeves might deem necessary for the Lournish Peasant Levy to carry with them into combat. Whatever they happen to be carrying, these guys are absolutely vital, and there are an awful lot of them. So you're going to see these guys in almost every single fight that Lourn finds itself in. Here we have a couple variations on Lournish infantry. On the left here are Lournish heavy infantry, usually slightly more heavily armored and given two-handed weapons such as spears, axes, and warhammers, large swords or shields, and hand weapons, other things like that. Some are given firearms, some are not. These guys' primary role is to, once defenses are broken, to spearhead an infantry invasion to a fortified location like a trench or a bunker. And their goal is to hack everybody down whilst the rest of the regular infantry follows behind them. These fellows to the right can be used for crewmen for anything from heavy machines to field guns. And as you see, they're not quite as heavily equipped. They don't have the signature packs that most infantrymen carry, and that's because these guys are backed up by supply trucks, as these guys are not very often on the front line, so they're much lighter armed. These infantry models here are Lournish officers. Lournish officers typically wear red somewhere on their body and are generally more heavily armored and more heavily armed than typical regular infantry. They don't carry their own packs, as these things are carried by personal servants, trucks, and pack animals. Lournish officers are sort of the weird crossover between the gentry of Lourn and the slightly better off sort of higher end peasants called Shire Reeves, which tend to run different parts of the country in place of a lord that may be absent. In times of war, they serve as officers to ground troops and will often be found commanding large throngs of Lournish peasant levies. Chaplains can come from anywhere in the Lournish hierarchy. Typically, one becomes a chaplain when they begin to prophesy or manifest miracles from the Lournish god. Chaplains are their leaders without question, and their presence on the battlefield is usually rather significant in that if the army feels the need to bring a chaplain like this, then they're facing a rather dire threat and believe they need the aid of God to intervene in this matter. So a Lournish chaplain will always carry a spear. In this case, this is it's like a staff or some kind of religious artifact. It's more for show, but it can be used as a weapon in a pinch. They're also equipped with things like knives, and as you can see, this chaplain is equipped with his own supply pack, his own rifle, and I believe he's got a sword on his belt there as well. Yeah, he does. So a fairly well-equipped individual, as well as in certain times can manifest miracles in the form of magic spells, although that is fairly rare. Lournish cavalry takes the form of Direwolf Riders. Direwolf Riders are some of the most recognizable of Lournish units, as there's nothing quite like them. Direwolf Riders are deadly in two respects. A, the riders are well trained, well disciplined, and are often ruthless killers. And second, so are their mounts. Even even a demounted rider will continue to fight, and his loyal mount will continue to fight alongside him. I was really excited to show these guys to you. I kind of want to make unmounted variants of both, as this would be really, really cool to see. I'm not sure if there's mechanics for unmounting riders in Gaslight, but I would be keen to look or homebrew them. Direwolf Riders also have a rather potent psychological effect on the battlefield. When coming to the support of infantry, it tends to bolster their morale, whilst at the same time, it's a pretty terrifying sight for anybody that's not on their side, because here comes this pack of very hungry, very big wolves with well-trained killers on their backs. Lournish Wolf Riders are always from higher classes, although typically lower nobility or lower knight classes will take up the role of Direwolf Rider. The life expectancy of these riders is not terribly high, as they are traditionally at the forefront of combat. They have no ranged weaponry to speak of, and their only defense is whatever weapons they're carrying and the teeth of their mounts. So it can be fairly rough if they find themselves against ranged units such as field guns or heavily armed enemy infantry. However, a charge from these guys can quickly shatter morale and can quickly punch giant holes in the lines of whoever they happen to be fighting. So that's the Lournish Direwolf Riders. Until recently, Lournish field guns were second to none in their heavy weaponry department. Field guns are the bread and butter of fortified and entrenched troops. They often fire low-velocity explosive shrapnel shells, which are meant to cause as much damage to enemy infantry as humanly possible. A field gun can be manned by as little as 2 people, but it is ideal to have 3, a loader, a gunner, and a spotter. These guys are typically on the back line in open combat. It would be pretty bad if they were to get gunned down. In entrenched situations, however, they tend to lodge themselves in things like buildings or build up earthworks around themselves to protect their flanks, and just fire shell after shell after shell in almost endless salvos from an entrenched and fortified location. However, the appearance of armored vehicles on enemy sides required the invention of something a little bit heavier. This variant of the Lournish field gun is an anti-armor variant. As you can see, it's a little bit heavier than the typical Lournish field gun. The amount of crew required is about the same, but these newer guns were brought into play with the appearance of armored cannons, armored mobile cannons, in our world known as tanks. And these were thrown together in a pinch in an attempt to counter this new threat. At the beginning of the campaign, Lourn is going to be invaded by a foreign power, which I will introduce once they're done. And these guns, while effective, their lifespan as a field gun variant was relatively short, as they were quickly mounted into something that could counter the low-velocity, non-armor piercing shells of the new enemy tanks. This is the Lournish GT3. It is now the premier anti-armor weapon used in the front lines of Lournish conflict today. These were invented as a quick counter to enemy tanks that have been showing up during the invasion of this other faction. And as you can see, it's fairly basic. It is a armored tracked hull with a gun sticking out of the front. It was cheaper and faster to build tanks in this manner because trying to build a standard pattern turret and hull tank that could, or rather quickly, was a it was just cheaper to make them this way. The gun that's loaded into them is the same anti-armor field gun that you saw previously. GT3 are crewed by a they're crewed by mostly peasant levies, although captained by gentry. So these are going to be sort of the armored knights of Lourn now, that command these big armored vehicles. So far, we're hoping that we're going to see some success, but a few things tend to plague these machines as they were quickly thrown together. This is the Mark III. The Mark 1 and 2 were test prototypes that did not last very long during conflict. These, however, have armored hulls that have proved to hold up a lot better against enemy fire. So we're going to be using these on the front. So those are the GT3s. Well, I hope it was as fun for you guys to hear about Lourn as it was fun for me to write about them and kitbash this stuff. We're going to be seeing some more factions introduced in a similar manner once they're done. And some of them are NPC factions, some of them are player factions. And what I mean by that is that there are other players besides me that are going to be taking advantage of this rule system. And we're going to be, if everything goes according to plan, we're going to be participating in sort of a joint effort. I guess you can call it a campaign, where we're going to have player versus player. We're going to have player versus NPC, NPC versus NPC, and we're going to see what this does to the face of the map and to see who comes out victorious. Some factions are more technologically advanced than others, and others are more numerous or have more magic than others. Lourn sits somewhere in the middle, where they have, because of their isolationism, they're a little bit behind in terms of technology, but they have decent numbers and they have a little bit of magic and a heck of a lot of grit. Anyway, again, I hope you enjoyed. We'll see you in the next one, and hopefully I can get some more videos like this out to you soon.